Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Now we will discuss a module on ethics in translation. It is from the course Translation Studies. The content of this module is written by Mr. Shiladitya Bhattacharya, Assistant Professor, GCI University, Mathura. Translation and ethics are interrelated terms. At the inception of the relatively new field of study called translation studies, the orientation and focus of it was different. With the changing of the time, the scope and focus of this field has broadened. The various socio-political changes in different parts of the world in the last few decades, along with new development in the social sciences in terms of novel outlooks ranging from post-colonialism, feminist interpretations, postmodernism and so forth, have provided new fuel for paradigm shifts. We have come across a long way since the early and mid 1940s, when translation was considered as a realm of linguistics, to the vibrant 1980s and 90s, when the cultural and social interpretations of translation freed translation studies from having lopsided or monodirectional. The presence of an ethical standpoint was made prominent at this point in time, which created further scopes of development in this particular domain. The students is expected to learn about the nature of ethics and its shades which are related with translation, the comprehensive historical background of translation studies and the shifting focus of it will enable the pupil to evaluate his or her respective positions regarding translation as a practice. The detailed presentation on the turn towards an ethical outlook of translation, along with the apt examples in the end, will give the pupil a new direction of thinking, dealing whereupon she or he might find new research projects best suited to her or his ambitions. Now, let us talk about shades and interchangeability, ethics as shades and interchangeability. The concept of ethics in itself is a complicated one, and like any other concept, it is multifaceted as well. Ethics, a term originating from the Greek word ethos, has gone through certain semantic and morphological changes via Latin ethice and Old French ethique, to finally share the room with morality. Often these two terms are used interchangeably, perhaps because some terms are common in the domain of inquiry for both, and these are virtue and vice, crime, pleasure and happiness, right and wrong, etc. The Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy points this out. The online edition of Encyclopedia Britannica actually attempts to define ethics in this manner. Ethics, also called moral philosophy, the discipline concerned with what are morally good and bad, right and wrong. The term is also applied to any system or theory of moral values or principles. Some scholars prefer a deviation from the transposable nature of ethics and morality as claimed or understood in the traditional literature, and calls for a distinction, however abstract that might seem. For example, we can cite the words of Paul and Elder, who are of the opinion that ethics can be studied in isolation. One can also look at these two terms from the perspective of social group or clan representation and call morality a social phenomena, while deeming ethics as personal judgments of right and wrong. Now, let us concentrate on religious sanction of ethical moral behavior and the reason behind the shades. Every culture seems to have its own codified ethical moral conducts, and the common feature in the otherwise varied systems of such conducts among various cultures is perhaps the sanction of the dominant religion. The origins of ethical or moral behavior in a society are essentially religious in nature, in evident if one looks at the code of Hammurabi, the 10 commandments in the Old Testament, or Plato's Protagoras, where Zeus bestows upon mankind the ability of a moral sense and justice in order to inculcate a sense of cooperation among them, which can prevent the man from the onslaught of powerful non-human creatures. Whether it is a pagan religion like that of the Hindus or the monotheistic Christianity, moral codes are introduced by wise men, saints and custodians like priests who are in direct relation with the divinity, which sanctions these codes law with such a narrative of divine origin planted in the minds of the public. The worshipping class could constitute its dominance over social interactions, material exchanges and governance. It is due to such intriguing religious versions of the origins of ethical and moral conducts, for which the traditional fuzziness between the two terms persist in some schools of thought even today. But these divine origin theories have been questioned and scrutinized. Plato himself challenged this idea in his dialogue named Euthyphro, in which he claims that there must be independent standards other than divine sanctions for moral or ethical actions. Later on, social Darwinism and studies on kinship and reciprocity among non-human animals, especially mammals and higher apes, has given enough proof about the existence of such rules independent of a divine thesis. Such practices, even among non-human animals of sufficient intelligence and a clan or herd based social life, tell us about an astonishing fact that such codes or rules of social behavior are genetically codified and carried over to generations. Now let us talk about ethics in translation. Our point of interest in this module is the ethics in translation. Ethics in translation theory and practice both can be viewed as applied ethics, a term that encompasses plethora of specialized fields in which ethical practices are necessary in real life situations. The shift in history from linguistic theories. There has been a shift in perspective towards translation since 1970s. The early views in their center had the idea of linguistic equivalence between the source text and the target translation. Linguistic equivalence simply translates into word-to-word fidelity of the text, falling short of which can lead to the violation of the ethics of translation practice. The noteworthy earliest of proponents of linguistics aspect of translation was Roman Jakobson. Jakobson in 1959 proposed that any comparison between two languages should be done according to their mutual translatability. He proposes that there exist three kinds of translation. First one is intralingual, second is interlingual, and third is intersemiotic. Eugene Nida has been a famous proponent of a linguistic based approach. Nida points out to the problem of synonym equivalences in the meaning of words across languages. He cites example of English words like run, whisper, and notes that these words can have a plethora of uses which might vary in meaning depending on the context. In order to achieve a semantic or pragmatic equivalence, Nida and Trevor in 1982 proposed two types of equivalence, namely formal and dynamic. Formal equivalence is equivalence in both the form and the content, whereas dynamic equivalence is based on the concept of the principle of equivalence effect, which roughly translates as finding equivalent terms in the target language to represent something of a similar semantics in the source language. Catford, in another famous proponent of a translation theory based on linguistic insights, his A Linguistic Theory of Translation, contributed to the field of translation in his development of types and shifts in translation. However, the linguistic theories centered around the language question, equivalence, mutual translatability, grammar systems, and discordant semantics of the source and the target language. While the contribution of linguistics as a discipline is still in effect with the contributions poured into by sociolinguistics and pragmatists at present, the earlier theories touched upon above were heavily criticized by commentators and scholars of the social sciences as lacking the human condition. Scholarly works like Snell and Hornby in 1988 accuses linguistic theories as that of Catford's as circular and thus illusionistic and negligent of textual or situational aspect, and thus reducing translation as a mere linguistic exercise. The search for equivalence has been severely criticized in the work of Bassnett in 1996, among others on the ground that there exists no equivalence between two same texts in a target language, let alone between two different languages. Now, let us talk about the paradigm shift in translation studies or in translation theory. A shift in translation theories in general came in about 1970s. The dichotomy between the faithful and the free gave way to the idea that there is more to translation than being just faithful or otherwise. The question of choice and decision, the stress of translation theory, has now shifted to the decision of the translator, as Pym in 1992 suggested. Postmodernism, a very fashionable concept in academic discourse as a whole during the 1980s, has been considered by many scholars, which marked the departure point. The new approaches like feminism, postcolonialism, cultural materialism, etc. were fed with novel developments in the social sciences, and the changing geopolitics brought forth new insights on social phenomena. A paradigm shift resulted in the inclusion of discussions of non-literary text as well as interpretation works, whereas the previous theories could only take into account the literary text. The comment of Koskinen in 2000 very briefly captures it in the following lines: "For anyone interested in theorizing about translation, the 1990s was a fascinating period. We witnessed a veritable fireworks of challenging new approaches. Redefinitions of translation have ranged from cannibalism to carnivalism, from hijacking to subversion, from manipulatory rewriting to regulated transformation. All these approaches have a common feature: they are all attempts to rethink the role of the translator. They all renounce the image of a subordinate faithful servant, turning to radically different metaphors of emancipation. Subversion or manipulation are hard to accommodate with an ethics of fidelity. It is therefore both interesting and necessary to search for an ethical framework compatible with our contemporary perceptions of translation." It is with this paradigm shift from linguistic aspect to the cultural aspect of translation studies mentioned above that the discourse of translation took an ethical turn. The final observation of the excerpt Koskinen mentioned previously predicts it. The inclusion of culture, racial identity, gender, post-colonialism, along with the nuanced discourse of newly emerging field of social sciences necessitated the importance of ethics in the business. The issue of fidelity was proposedly extended from the text to the culture and thereby the reader of the translated text. The problem of the ethical and the unethical. The linguistic theories are blamed upon by post-colonial and postmodern scholars for not considering the cultural factor in. The proposed aim of the linguistic approach is to achieve a literal equivalence between the two texts, and scholars argue that while doing this, it is the politics and social milieu of the text as well as the target reader that are neglected. A gap is thus created. The functional approach attempts to fill that gap up with the appendage of the aim or purpose of the translation in practice. It suggests some creative liberties than the translator can take. For example, Surtken in 2007 argues that depending on the sociolinguistic needs, different strategies should be followed for minors and adults to appropriate the needs. The usual strategies are like elimination or reduction of information, expansion and exoticism, finding equivalent expressions from culture specific terms in the source language, keeping in mind the focus of scopus theory oriented translations. Such things can be accepted. According to eminent scholars in the area of ethical choices in translation, if translation is a choice among the set of choices present before the translator, she or he cannot escape the fact that her or his choice is based on moral or ethical grounds and value judgments. Ethical problems are often considered as two-folded. In one hand, there is concerns about the professional norms such as legal issues like copyright, contract, and there are codes of practice and expectation of the society on the translator for a good translation work. On the other hand, there is personal moral question. Often it is seen that maintaining a balance between the both seems impossible. The question of choice become very important here, whether to follow the restrictive normative codes or to opt for something radically different in order to follow one's own moral position is indeed a hard question. Norms can come to the help of the translator as individual choices can be plenty and thus painful to choose from, but at the same time strictly following norms can actually hinder the process, as there might be situational requirement of exercising the moral choice on the part of the translator. Now, let us talk about ethical dilemmas and problems. In this section, we are going to take a brief look at some examples of ethical and moral problems faced by the translators on an everyday basis. Baker and Meyer in 2011 argues from the perspective of pedagogy that students who intend to become professional translators and interpreters have to be provided with a apt methodology which can help them choose the ethical direction in the wake of moral confusions. The following examples are taken from the information booklet of 2016 published by the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, NATI, Australia. NATI is a standard organization responsible for maintaining, setting and promoting high standards of work. These are some situational examples which test the ethical credibility of an applicant who wishes to be a professional translator and interpreter in Australia. For detailed understanding of the information what are provided by the NATI in Australia, We have few examples given in the E context from the Nutty Information booklet, which was published in 2016. So, for your further reading, you can see the examples from the E content, and you can compare, you can refer those examples for having better understanding of this context. Whatever examples we have put on in the E text, if you see those examples, you can find that problems of judgments are hard to handle. Certain professional agencies that provide translational and interpreting services set up their ethical standpoints in very professional way. It is, however, not easy for a freelance translator if she or he does not have a proper training for the job. But ethical or moral challenges before the translator, interpreter do not restrict within the scopes described above. Baker and Meyer in 2011 provides a simple example of a person named Catherine Gunn, who worked as a Chinese translator for the British government. Catherine was prosecuted under law as she leaked secret government documents. Outwardly, this might seem illegal, but when one considers the nature of the leaked document, which stands proof of illegal business transaction made by the British and the American government, one could only imagine that she took a moral stand and paid a heavy price of it. The same paper has several such instances where translators violated professional codes of ethics and acted upon moral judgments. Another case study from the paper mentions a translator who was given a job for French voiceover for a prestigious religious organization. The video that he worked for was clearly anti-gay, whereas the translator seemed to have different opinion about it. In a vengeful act, the person did not correct the grammatical mistakes that were there in order to keep his moral integrity right. Exemplifying this, the authors of the translators rather preparing them for the actual field jobs. In order to handle such dilemmas, the authors propose a change in the pedagogy of translator training programs and call for classroom deliberations on case studies of the similar nature mentioned above. It is essential to follow the code of professional ethics also. It is of vital importance that one does not indulge in illegal or other activities that they do not subscribe to. In order to learn the balance, the ethical code against the moral judgments of an individual discussion, deliberation and discourses must be invited during the training of professionals attempting at translation as a career. Translational ethics is intertwined with the moral, political, social obligations of the translator, and so critical evaluation of the situation and not simply following the strict code of professional ethics can help solving these dilemmas. Now, let us summarize this module. In this module, we talked about general nature of ethics and its relevance in terms of practicing translation. The initial focus from linguistic equivalence or mutual translatability simply does not address the cultural, social or complex ethical issues related to translation. Moreover, translation studies as a field of study has emerged as a mature, independent field of research in academics. So, it needs to address its own issues independent of any prescriptive orientation. However, as translation is both a linguistic and cultural task, it needs to find a direction towards which it can bridge the gaps created by independent linguistic and cultural orientation of the field. What it needs today is interdisciplinary outlook. Ethics stands as an integral part of translation and interpretation, and no more as separate perspective. In order for one to become a translator or interpreter in the present world, one need to address the ethical moral question, equip oneself with the complex nature of the interrelation between professional ethics and personal moral stands. One can always be self-taught, but the ethical component has to be perceived either by experience or better by going through a proper training in this manner. Thank you.